Greetings all CHP listeners, old and new. Laszlo Montgomery here, warmly welcoming you to the China History Podcast. Part 6 today in our little dime store overview of the history of Singapore. We started off in the 14th century with the legendary founding of Temasek, and we've followed many of the historical milestones over 6 centuries up to the 1900s. And as we closed out Part 5 last time, the Japanese had just invaded, and I welcome you all to check out Ray Harris's History of World War II podcast to get a deeper dive on all the details of Japan's takeover of Malaya and Singapore. Quite a story. I only introduced the bullet points: Great Britain's efforts to fortify the island and turn it into Fortress Singapore, their Gibraltar of the East and a bastion of British might. Didn't go well. Despite all the belated efforts and exorbitant expense, the Japanese army came in and took the place over in a week. On December 16, 1941, after the shocking events of December 7th and 8th, days that forever live in infamy, the British had to abandon Penang to the Japanese and commence their retreat southward. On Boxing Day, December 26th, the Japanese army took the city of Ipoh. 17 days later, they took Kuala Lumpur, forcing the British even further south to Johor. And by the end of January, all of British Malaya fell to Japan. And like I said last time, the Japanese army crossed into Singapore on February 8th, and on the 15th came the surrender. And today, we'll look at what happened after that. Anyone in Singapore, born 1930 or before, who survived those weeks that followed the British surrender, would be hard-pressed to forget the chamber of horrors that followed right after. To set the tone for what was in store for Singapore's mostly Chinese residents, let's take a look at what happened at the British military hospital there. Today known as Alexandra Hospital, 378 Alexandra Road. It's one of several state-of-the-art medical institutions in Singapore. Alexandra Hospital is affiliated with the National University there. It had opened in July 1940, and back then, as the hospital is today, it was one of the best in all of Asia. In early February 1942, when Japan was making its way to the center of Singapore, the last of the British and Commonwealth troops who were defending the island set up machine gun nests there to fire on any approaching Japanese, desperately trying to buy time to allow as many people as possible to escape. As the Japanese made their way in the direction of the hospital, a British officer walked out of the doors to meet them, carrying a white flag to announce that all non-combatants inside were surrendering without a fight. To set the tone for what was to follow, the man was bayoneted on the spot, the first one to die there that day. Then the Japanese soldiers went inside and started killing everyone. Sick, injured, and dying soldiers were bayoneted in their beds and brutally murdered. Even doctors and patients in the middle of surgery faced the same grim ending. About 250 or more people died in that Alexandra Hospital massacre during the 11th and 12th of February 1942. I mentioned Britain threw in the towel on February 15th. But prior to that, a few hours after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 8th, Singapore time, bombs started raining down on the Lion City. Sang Nila Usama, Stamford Raffles, and all the past historical figures from then to now, the Sultans, the Temengongs, who could have ever imagined the scene that their Singapura was now witnessing? Like the shock and awe tactics we've become so accustomed to in our day, Mitsubishi aircraft dropped bombs, fired machine guns, and spread an unprecedented amount of terror on the local people. Most Singaporeans were merely running for their lives. As the city burned, people huddled together, shoulder to shoulder in underground bomb shelters, doing their best to survive the ordeal. Others were running through the streets as the machine guns of the Mitsubishi Zeros strafed the roads. Many fled in the direction of the wharves, where a crush of people were already trying desperately to flee. You can imagine under these circumstances, the utilities all went dead, all wooden buildings were on fire. Everyone up to that point had been living such normal lives. We've seen over the past 5 episodes how spectacular the Singapore story was. And now this. The idea behind this terrifying bombing of Singapore was to soften up the populace and get them sufficiently shell-shocked so as not to try anything funny when the Japanese imperial troops came marching down Orchard and Bukit Timah roads. But before those guys showed up, something far worse preceded them. This was the Kempei Tai, the Japanese military police. Among many other roles, the Kempei Tai was in charge of civilian control and suppressing resistance, like the German Gestapo, Russian KGB, and Romanian Securitate. Their cruelty and effectiveness was legendary. And now came Singapore's turn to suffer their worst. In China, by 1938, every city dweller knew about the Xianbing Dui and what they were capable of. There were about 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops who surrendered, and maybe 3,000 European civilians. They were told to go pack a bag and meet down at the Padang. And they were all rounded up and marched down Beach Road and East Coast Road in the direction of Changi, where the airport is located today on the eastern edges of Singapore, about a 15-mile walk, though I'm sure on that day it felt much longer. They arrived the next day, and everyone got sorted out, and for the next 42 months, it was living hell for them. But we're left with many great stories of survival, and some of you recall James Clavell, the author who inspired me half a century ago. He was an internee at Changi Prison and wrote his first novel in 1962, King Rat, about his experience as an internee. The book was made into a movie in 1965, George Segal acting in the role of Corporal King. A lot of the internees ended up getting sent to the jungles of Thailand to go build the death railway that ran from there to Burma. That story of bravery and heroism in the face of terrible suffering was also made into a movie in 1957 called The Bridge on the River Kwai. Meanwhile, as the Europeans resigned themselves to their fate in the Changi POW camp, the Japanese also separately rounded up all Malay and Indian residents who had fought on the side of the British against the Japanese. There were maybe about 1,000 of these soldiers who had all tried to blend in with the crowds when all was lost. But still, 400 of them came forward, all of them probably knowing this was a self-imposed death sentence. The officers were all shot on sight, but everyone else was let off with a slap on the wrist and released. The message the Japanese authorities were sending was, Asia was for Asians, solidarity, we got to look out for each other. They advocated for their greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere and called for everyone in East Asia to unite to ensure their own economic well-being through the cooperation of the member states and to resist Western imperialism and communism. Throughout the war, Japan talked a good game about this whole idea of racial equality and co-prosperity, but their actions spoke louder than their propaganda. And like in Hong Kong, and anywhere else to be sure, their behavior ended up making the despised British look good. So the Japanese took care of the Europeans, the Malays, and Indians. Now it was the turn of Singapore's Chinese to be dealt with. And this is where we get the Sook Ching Massacre, the Sook Ching Massacre. The man in charge at the top was Yamashita Tomoyuki, also known as the Tiger of Malaya and the Beast of Bataan. He later served as military governor in the Philippines. The Allies hung him high as a war criminal on February 23, 1946. But once Yamashita raised the Mission Accomplished banner in Singapore and got the photo op, he went off to go conquer Sumatra next. The ones who directed Operation Sook Ching were Colonel Tsuji Tominosuke and Lieutenant Colonel Oishi Masayuki. This word, Sook Ching, the Japanese called it the Great Inspection or purification through purge. The Singaporean historians called it a Great Purge or eradication. It was all part of the Japanese takeover of Singapore. General Yamashita gave Tsuji and Oishi 2 days to deal with this matter, but it lasted from February 18th to March 4th, again in 1942. It all began when Chinese men aged between 18 and 50 were ordered to report to one of 5 screening centers. At each of these locations, they were put through the ringer a few times, and whoever was on duty would decide by unscientific and arbitrary reasoning whether or not the person standing before them was anti-Japanese or a potential troublemaker. And if you were, you got taken away and shot. Simple as that. How one dressed, their deportment, did they speak English, were they educated, who did they work for, did they wear glasses, was there something about them that just plain old looked suspicious? Well, whoever was on duty, not going by any rules, just a hunch, if they suspected you as having been anti-Japanese before, or even Brit-friendly, you got taken away and were never seen or heard from again. They were taken to any of the main execution grounds in Changi or Pungal, Tanah Merah, Katong, or to a location near to where the Bukit location of the Singapore Island Country Club is today. Many were machine-gunned to death and tossed into mass graves. There's a monument at Changi Beach Park that has a plaque that reads, quote, 66 male civilians were killed by Japanese Hojo Kempei firing at the water's edge on this stretch of Changi Beach on 20th of February 1942. They were among tens of thousands who lost their lives during the Japanese Sook Ching operation to purge suspected anti-Japanese civilians among Singapore's Chinese population between 18th of February and 4th of March 1942. Tanah Merah Besar Beach, a few hundred meters south, was one of the most heavily used killing grounds where well over 1,000 Chinese men and youths lost their lives. End quote. Years later, the Japanese owned up to 5,000 dead in the Sook Ching Massacre. Other estimates put the number at around 25,000. Some estimates are even higher than that. By March of 1942, the operation was called off. In its final days, the whole thing turned into a nonstop kill fest. The truth of it was, all the big fish that the Kempei Tai were looking for, the ringleaders, the ones who spoke out the most against Japanese aggression in China, they had already flown the coop. They were gone. Whoever remained, they weren't who the Japanese were looking for. But thousands lost their lives in the most inhumane ways, sometimes following torture. And this Sook Ching Massacre, you could say it sort of set the tone for the remainder of the Japanese occupation. With the whole Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere thing, Chinese and Japanese were supposed to be on the same team. But as it was elsewhere in China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, Burma, Indonesia, and the Philippines, the Japanese occupation didn't win many adherents to this whole co-prosperity sphere idea, which everyone knew was simply a power grab and a case of 指鹿为马, pointing at a deer and calling it a horse. 1942 was quite a good year for the Empire of Japan, but come February 1943, their luck will change after the combined forces of Americans, ANZ, and UK troops handed the Japanese military their heads at Guadalcanal after a campaign that took 6 months and 2 days. And though the war still had 2.5 years to go before the Japanese surrender in August 1945, it was all downhill for Japan from that point forward. In Singapore and Malaya, there was very stiff resistance to Japan. I wanted to just quickly mention Lim Po Sang and Force 136. He was a Hokkien Chinese who had come from Nan'an near Quanzhou. He's remembered for being a leading resistance fighter against the Japanese, and like Tankaki, mentioned last time in Part 5, He tirelessly engaged in fundraising for the motherland after the Japanese invasion in July 1937. Lim Po Sang was able to get out of Singapore before the Japanese came and ended up in India, where he joined up with Force 136. They worked covertly in Malaya to arm and supply local resistance movements who agitated against Japan and carried out all manners of acts of sabotage against the Japanese military. The British ran Force 136, but they trained the Indian, Burmese, and Chinese operatives to carry out their missions. Many war heroes came from this outfit. Though they didn't particularly care for each other, Force 136 worked together with the MCP, or Malayan Communist Party, to deal one bloody nose after another to Japanese forces. Lim Po Sang had been secreted into Malaya via a Dutch submarine and organized with his British handlers and local resistance fighters. In early 1944, the network that had been created in Malaya was uncovered through the interrogation of a captured guerrilla fighter, and the Kempe Tai raided the headquarters of the spy network on Pankor Island off the Perak coast. Lim Po Sang was among the leaders of the resistance who was captured by the Kempe Tai. And as he lay suffering from dysentery, Lim was tortured for about a month. On June 29, 1944, he died and was buried in an unmarked grave. But after the war, his wife and eldest son went to Malaya and recovered his remains and brought them to Singapore. And he was praised and honored as a war hero and became one of the symbols of Singaporean resistance to Japanese occupation. On June 29, 1954, a memorial was unveiled on the Singapore Esplanade, right at the mouth of the Singapore River where the earliest history took place. Lim Po Sang wasn't the only great Singaporean hero from this dark time, but he's one of the most celebrated. Let me also just quickly mention another heroic paramilitary force that did extensive damage to the Japanese up in Malaya. And this was the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, or MPAJA. They were a communist-led guerrilla force who did their worst in Malaya between 1941 and 1945. Although the MPAJA had many Malays who fought with them, they were overwhelmingly an ethnic Chinese force. Growing hatred among Malayan Chinese started to escalate following the Mukden incident on 9/18/31. As Japanese aggression in China began to ramp up, anti-Japanese elements among the populace began to coalesce around the Malayan Communist Party. And they had two main enemies. First were the Japanese, and second were the British colonialists. But following the Japanese invasion of Malaya, the two sides, the British and the MPAJA, they put their rivalry on ice and joined together to fight their common enemy. Following the fall of Singapore, the two sides lost contact with each other. More about them later on in the episode. But getting back to the early period of the takeover of Singapore, there were a lot of new rules and a whole lot of changes made. As the Japanese did elsewhere, they went and renamed the streets and landmarks, and everyone had to revere Emperor Hirohito, who, if I may humbly say, I share a birthday with. And no kidding, all the clocks in Singapore had to be moved forward an hour and a half to match Tokyo time. The Japanese calendar was implemented, replete with Japanese holidays that had to be observed, and the name of the colony, Singapore, during the occupation was renamed Sionanto, or Jiaonantao in Mandarin, the Light of the South. A civil and military administration was built from the ground up. By March-April 1942, most public utilities had been restored and basic services were running again. The Japanese turned Singapore into their naval base. Mitsubishi took over the Keppel shipyards, where, over the course of the occupation, more than 2,000 Japanese vessels were repaired and kept active for the duration of the war. Yeah, there was that and dozens of other things the Singaporean people had to be vigilant about. The island was riddled with collaborators and spies, no small number of people struggling to keep their noses above the waterline, opted to make their lives a little easier by working for the Japanese, openly or secretly. The Japanese laid the Japanization on thick. There was a media and propaganda blitz the likes of which had never been seen before. Well, they didn't like it in Hong Kong, and the same went with Singapore. Most people adopted the attitude that if they had to bow and scrape for the next 42 months, so be it. Survival was the North Star that people adopted. The new Japanese currency that was issued, well, you could guess what happened with that as the months ticked by. By the end of the war, it was essentially worthless after wearing out a few printing presses. So Japan burned through a lot of money to pull this whole thing off. And now they called in the big guns in the Chinese communities of the former colonies that they now occupied. And in no uncertain terms, they said to them, for all the resistance against us and for aiding our enemies and slowing us down, you have to come up with $50 million. It was no secret that after 1937, the Singaporean and Malay Chinese, more than anyone else, had lent the most overseas financial support for the Republic of China government in the fight against Japan. And now the Japanese were going to make them pay for that. And the Kempei Tai instituted a reign of terror that was so hated and resented, the repercussions still resonate today. So this $50 million gift, as it was styled, was divided up amongst all of Southeast Asia's Chinese. The Overseas Chinese Association had to act as the organizer. In order to put together $50 million, aside from dipping into their own funds, they had to take out $22 million in loans from designated Japanese banks at 6% interest. A lot of people got tortured in the fundraising process and forced to endure terrible suffering. This old trick of absconding with the assets and wealth of conquered peoples, well, this wasn't some new phenomenon never seen before. The Spanish conquistadors did it. So did communist governments. The Mongols did too. Napoleon, the EIC, and Belgian Congo. And now, Imperial Japan joined that ignoble list. It didn't take long at all for food shortages to start. Already by April 1942, it was evident. Simple economics meant, as rice, oil, and fuel started to become scarce, prices went up. The Japanese kept having to crank up that press to print more of this banana currency, as it was referred to. Once it was clear the Japanese, like most occupiers, were going to screw the pooch as far as the management of the Singapore economy, that's when the black market economy kicked into overdrive and lasted well past the Japanese surrender in 1945. As we all know from all the books, movies, documentaries, and all the lessons from our respective patriotic education, this World War II nightmare did finally come to an end. For Singaporeans, this had become readily apparent in late 1944 when American B-29s started bombing Japanese targets there. Then, daily life in Singapore couldn't have gotten any more desperate. Japanese troops were even going so far as to begin building their own internment camp for what was surely to come later. And in the early morning of May 7th, 1945, after Germany surrendered unconditionally at Allied headquarters in Reims, France, everyone knew Japan's turn was next and not too far off. In June came the Battle of Okinawa, then the Potsdam Conference, the Trinity Test on July 16th, and finally the 2 atomic bombs. And on August 15th, 1945, Japan surrendered. A week later, the British returned to Singapore, and on September 12th, 1945, at City Hall, Japan signed the formal surrender document with Lord Louis Mountbatten on hand to receive it. And for the immediate period following the return of the British and the rounding up of the Japanese, Singaporeans who had been done wrong by collaborators and those who cooperated with the Japanese occupiers went on an extended period of vengeance lasting almost a month. The oppressed were now the oppressors with a free hand to seek retribution. And, well, you all know how people are. Those who could find ways to escape skedaddled as fast and as far away as they could. But for those Singaporeans who didn't have anywhere else to go and who willingly or unwillingly worked with the occupiers, aiding in the oppression of the island's residents, they got whacked. Earlier, I mentioned the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army. Well, they were the ones who crossed over into Singapore and took charge of this carnival of vengeance and revenge killing. There was about a 3-week interregnum between the time of the Japanese surrender in Singapore and the arrival of British troops and the establishment of order. And in an act that still hasn't been forgotten, the MPAJA soldiers also let loose on the Singaporean Malays who collaborated secretly or openly with the Japanese. This included those Malays who merely served as policemen during the occupation. And with most of these MPAJA guerrillas being ethnic Chinese, the optics of that whole action didn't look that great. Following the return of the British to Malaya, the MPAJA was gradually defanged and disarmed, but this wasn't before they pushed back quite violently against British attempts to restore order. The Sook Ching Massacre caused the single greatest loss of life during the occupation, but untold tens of thousands more died throughout the occupation from all the other great killers from world history: execution, torture, malnutrition, starvation, forced labor, and disease. And understandably, there were no small number of local Singaporean people who resolved to get even with their tormentors and accessories to the 42 months of suffering. And though I won't get into any details, the retribution and frontier justice meted out up in Malaya was equally, if not more, brutal. And not all of it was administered by the MPAJA. One good thing that came out of World War II was that everyone knew the age of imperialism was winding down. The defeat of the British, Dutch, and French at the hands of an Asian power and the humiliations meted out on them for all locals to witness provided all the necessary optics that assured the colonized they didn't need these foreigners anymore. The European powers had played their part in creating many of the great cities across Asia. In Southeast Asia, at least, new emerging nationalist movements began to take over from there. In Singapore, the British were counting on something other than what ended up transpiring. Best case scenario, the British counted on being able to rewind the clock to before 1941. Wishful thinking. It was fairly evident that the best they could hope for was to slow walk Singapore in the direction of self-rule. To try and restore everything back to some semblance of pre-war order, the British set up the BMA, the British Military Administration. Plans had been in the works back in London to brainstorm what was to come next. Because the Japanese surrender had come so quickly following the atomic bombings, there was no way to implement any careful plans. As a stopgap, there was this British Military Administration. There's a Chinese saying that goes, 搬起石头砸自己的脚, to lift a rock and drop it on your foot. Well, that's what the British did with the BMA. This was the first of several miscalculations made by the British when they tried to reestablish rule over Singapore, Malaya, and all their colonies, in fact. The BMA did a horrific job, and nothing they implemented endeared the local people to their governance. After an unmitigated failure that did more harm than good, the British military administration period ended in February 1946. As World War I did, World War II also emptied out the British exchequer. They went from being the largest creditor to the largest debtor. And that's what wars do. I don't know why we keep having them. They're expensive and costly to clean up after. And perhaps worst of all, they leave behind hard feelings that have a long half-life that lingers on for seemingly forever. But once the supply chains were able to be cranked up, the cargo vessels started coming and going from the port of Singapore, filled with tin, rubber, oil, and hundreds of other categories of products. It brought in plenty of money for Britain, just like the good old days. The government back in London and everyone along the chain of command in Singapore knew this wasn't going to last indefinitely. So a strategy was adopted to milk this for as long as possible, and in walking away, cut the best possible deal for Britain. Things were happening so fast. Indian independence came in 1947, Burma's came in 1948, and Great Britain knew at the war's end that the jig was up. All that past greatness, it was good while it lasted. What a swell 200 years it had been. By the late 1940s, the post-war economy was roaring back, and the 1950 to 1953 Korean War further stoked the fires of the Singapore economy. The victory of Mao and the Communist Party of China caused a disruption in the two-way trade and trade finance. And if you recall in Part 1, when the Yuan dynasty was on its last legs, that too had a negative impact on trade with Temasek. Well, one thing was for sure, immigration fell off the end of the table. It became near impossible to exit China after 1949, so the number of Chinese coming from the mainland saw a dramatic drop. And as it did in Russia, in China, and Vietnam, and throughout Southeast Asia, wherever there was rampant popular despair, illiteracy, and poverty among the lower classes, communist operatives saw fertile ground for recruitment, and no matter whether one was communist or nationalist-leaning, no one was going to continue to tolerate Britain or any imperialist power. Communists, unionists, and leftists combined to make their voice heard and got the message out that business as usual was over, and sooner or later, preferably sooner, the British had to go. The French were feeling it in Indochina and the Dutch down in Indonesia. By this time, the population of Malaya and Singapore totaled around 5 million people. 50% were Malay, 38% were Chinese, and 11% were Indian. The communists had around 12,000 members, mostly ethnic Chinese. And one of the early influential bodies to emerge was the Pan-Malayan Federation of Trade Unions. They were an umbrella organization that worked to get multiracial workers to join hands with other left-wing political groups and like-minded people, and they organized more than 300 strikes just in 1947. Post-war, the matter of a sense of Singaporean identity began to gain momentum as this wave of nationalism across South and Southeast Asia became a common aspiration. Everyone would ultimately achieve their aspirations, but it came sooner to some than to others. When failed policies such as the implementation of the British military administration fell flat, the demands for changes became even louder. This was true all across British Malaya and Singapore. With the rejection of any attempts by the British to go back to the way things used to be, the government was resigned to its fate. The times, they were changing, and Britain had to change with the times. And this was where the idea of the Malayan Union came about. While World War II was still raging in Asia, the London-based Malaya Planning Unit was set up and tasked with coming up with a plan for Malayan independence. The British were really hoping to keep Singapore and Malaya in one single political entity ruled from London. Every indication was that this was not a popular idea on the peninsula, but that desperate hope to hang on to what they once had, and many were trying to keep this pipe dream alive. All those bulk commodity exports out to the world was sure a nice source of revenue for Britain. That alone was worth the effort to slow walk this whole notion down to a crawl. For the rest of this episode, let's look at the political events that followed the formation of the Malayan Union. A thorny issue emerged regarding the matter of the native Malays who were indigenous to Malaya and the Chinese who, although great in numbers, were not indigenous. They came from China, or their forebears did. The belief was you were Malay or not Malay, and Chinese, even Peranicans and those born and living in Malaya for generations, going back to the Ming Dynasty, faced a sensitive political and social challenge. In Singapore, from day one, going back to Raffles, the British kept everyone separate. The city was carved up in such a way that Chinese, Malay, Indian, Arab, and Europeans were all segregated and lived in their own enclaves. In no way was multiracial unity encouraged. But now, the British were calling for unity and for everyone, Malay and non-Malay, to join hands together with common citizenship for the betterment of Malaya's future. In January 1946, the Malayan Union plan was announced. At once there was loud Malay opposition. By having the British as the central authority governing the 9 Malayan states, Penang and Malacca, many felt this was never going to work. The British had to go, period. The Malayan communists had been waging a non-stop war of propaganda to win over the hearts and minds of the common Malayan folk, regardless of their ethnic background. And by 1946, their message had been spread far and wide. The British were wise to the matter of Singapore and Malaya's relationship. They didn't want to force anything that might cause too much resistance. And besides, because of its free port and British naval facilities there, Singapore remained simply too important to Britain. Over a century of British cooperation with the Chinese merchant class there had created a central nervous system that managed all the trade finance, and logistics that kept the commodities flowing to the port and out into the world. And so this matter of was Singapore a part of Malaya or not, it became one of the hot topics in post-World War II political discourse. No small number of Singaporeans saw merit in the notion of remaining a British Crown colony like Australia and New Zealand. If you were living at or near the tip-top of Singapore society, why upset the apple cart? Other than perhaps a good-natured contempt for the British and Westerners, they had no complaints. But there were too many others who believed being forced into a union with Malaya wasn't the best thing for Singapore. When all things considered, it was decided to leave Singapore out of the Malayan Union. So even though the British knew the idea of the Malayan Union was not going to be welcomed, they counted on everyone ultimately giving in to the inevitable. But emerging Malay leaders weren't convinced this was inevitable at all. And once the Strait Settlement was dissolved, the Malayan Union was inaugurated on April 1st. And the protests among Malayan political leaders was most vociferous in its opposition. This was a step backwards, not into the future. The 9 Malay states had been resisting Britain ever since the 18th century, so being asked yet again to accept them as the ones in charge was just as repugnant as it had ever been. And the man tasked with making this happen, Sir Harold MacMichael, he lacked the soft touch and subtlety that was going to be necessary if the Malayan Union had a chance. MacMichael later went on to serve as High Commissioner of the British Mandate of Palestine, so he went from one thankless and impossible job to another. Sultan Ibrahim of Johor was game. He was open to the idea of the Malayan Union, at first. Not surprising, considering Johor's recent historic ties with Great Britain. But as for the other sultans, they were forced to go along with the Union, pretty much under duress, I guess you could say. You see, during the war, for the sake of their very own survival, the sultans, some more than others, had to bow to Japanese wishes. One of the ways they were cajoled by the British negotiators into joining the Malayan Union was the threat of exposure of their collaboration with the Japanese military during the war years. So both Harold MacMichael and the whole British idea of the Malayan Union was utterly rejected and led to a blossoming of Malayan nationalism instead that washed over the peninsula. I haven't been mentioning this, but the Malayan anti-colonial struggle for Bangsa Melayu, a Malay nation, had been going on in the background throughout the 19th century. The sticking point revolved around the non-Malay residents of Malaya being granted citizenship and, by extension, having a say in the future destiny of the country. This non-Malay portion of Malaya wasn't a small number. As I indicated, it was just about half the country. That's how many people had migrated there over the past century and a half. And by the way, if Singapore had been added to the mix, all it would have done was further dilute Malay political voices and the final outcome in matters of national importance once independence came. The Malayan Indians and Malayan Chinese, well, they wanted a voice also in how things were going to be. They too had been agitating against the British for more of a say in governance. The Javanese and Bugis population in Malaya assimilated more easily and had no problems adopting Malayan cultural identity. The problem was the Chinese, and to a lesser extent the Indians. It was fine if they were simply transient laborers who came there to work for a few years and go home. But once they started settling and demanding a seat at the Malayan political table, well, that's where sparks began to fly. Because of the demographics that evolved since the 19th century, ethnic equality wasn't what the Malays were hoping for as far as their future nation was concerned. Without being offered any status or even acknowledgement for their specialness, Malay political leaders began fighting back. Sir Edward Gent was the first one to face their fury after he was installed as the first governor of the Malayan Union. He was one of many so-called Western Asian experts who was put on a pedestal by Europeans for his erudition about all things Asia, but who many Asian people scoffed at and felt, he didn't know you-know-what. The one who emerged as the early dominant voice of the Malayan nationalist movement was Dato' On bin Jafar, known popularly as Dato' On. A Dato' was a variant of the honorific title Datuk that is bestowed upon someone by the Yang di Pertuan Agong, or King of Malaysia. Dato' On was born in Johor in 1895 and had an English boarding school education. His father had served as the chief minister in Johor, so he didn't just come out of nowhere. So just as the American colonists did for the first time ever back in October 1765 with the historic Stamp Act Congress, Dato' On, along with a few other Malay leaders, called for a meeting of concerned Malay politicians and nationalists who assembled in Kuala Lumpur on March 1st, 1946. And this was called the First All-Malay Congress. And you could be sure they dumped all over the Malayan Union and the direction the British were taking. And Dato' On called for a new political party to be formed that represented the interests of the Malay people. And this was the United Malays National Organization, or UMNO, Malaysia's first mass party and movement. They drew an indelible line in the sand with Britain as far as the way things were going to be. There was a time when British resolve and a stiff upper lip would have forced them to back down, or else. But not this time. Not after everything that had happened between 1942 and 1945.
You know, it wouldn't be until 1964 when the Fab Four would restore Britain to its former greatness.
But because of the state of Britain in 1946, no one in Malaya felt compelled or even willing to line up behind them. And the Brits couldn't hold back UMNO's political agenda any more than they could hold back the ocean tides. And as I indicated, chief among the gripes they had involved the unpopular idea of allowing non-Malays a share of power in the future country. And to show the Brits how much they were not on board with the whole Malayan Union idea, when it came time for the signing ceremony on April 1st, 1946, none of the 9 sultans showed up. They were going to be the guests of honor, the main props to give this whole ill-fated idea the gravitas it needed. They had all first assembled at a hotel on Singapore's historic Padang. Dato' On spoke to their Royal Highnesses and delivered a rousing speech. And following these remarks from Dato' On, the 9 sultans refused to attend the signing ceremony. And with that dramatic act, they delivered a very resounding snub to Sir Edward Gent, the father of the Malayan Union. Well, so much for the Malayan Union. That didn't go as planned. And as soon as it began, it started to wind down. And on May 11th, 1946, it was declared dead on arrival. The British caved on the matter of challenging the Sultan's authority. They did agree on the proposed idea of a Malayan federation. They got rid of the title of governor and replaced it with a high commissioner. And as far as the matter of the citizenship and political rights of non-Malays, well, that elephant in the room got pushed behind the curtains, and they deal with that when the time came. The workaround was that no one had to come out and mention the matter of citizenship. It defined the Malayu people as those who spoke Malay, followed Islam, and lived in harmony with Malay customs and culture. Not many Chinese could win that trifecta. Singapore remained a crown colony, and for the time being, they would remain apart from what was going on north of the Johor Strait. On February 1st, 1948, the 9 sultans formally joined together to form the new Federation of Malaya. The August 14, 1941 Atlantic Charter, signed by Roosevelt and Churchill, said it in writing that all people have the right to choose the form of government under which they will live. And that's what happened with the Federation of Malaya. The Federation gave greater local autonomy to the sultans with the final authority over religious and Malay customs. It was a compromise that mostly satisfied the Malay population and managed to allow for a degree of political representation for non-Malays. The Federation of Malaya would later go on to achieve independence on August 31st, 1957. That's all for next time. British government dreams of joining Malaya with Singapore, Sarawak, North Borneo, and Brunei were fading fast. Those hopes conflicted with the aspirations of Malaya's new leaders. So while Malayan politics went in one direction, Singapore's went in another direction. And next time when we meet, we'll see what happened in Singapore. We'll also introduce Singapore's great man, the Honorable Lee Kuan Yew, and I think a fair amount of Singapore's history from the mid-50s up through 2015 can be told through presenting the story of his life and achievements. So if you made it this far, really, you might as well tough it out for the next few episodes. No panhandling or requests for alms. I only ask that you consider coming back next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.